last week's talk was called The Noise We Hear. So we started our talk on the relationship series with Dave read a whole bunch of statistics and spent a whole night explaining and just kind of breaking down, like, this is the noise that you guys hear from our culture and from the media and from pop culture and from like teachers, parents, other people in life. The noise we hear about our sexuality and about relationships, and just how it gets so jumbled up and how so many of the wrong things are emphasized and stressed. And we talked about how many like visual images of sex you guys see a year just from like TV or music videos alone, and it was like in the thousands, right? And the percentages of those TV shows and music videos and stuff that had sex or just mentioned it in there, and it was like in the 70s, 80s, 90%. And the point was just to say that you guys are surrounded with messages about relationships. And oftentimes, they don't line up with the message that Scripture teaches us about relationships, the way God has planned for us to engage in relationships in our lives. And so, what we wanted to do in this relationship series was to just talk about that with you guys. And the reason was, and Dave said this last week, and I want to re-emphasize this week, those messages that come to you guys through the media and through all those other outlets that bombard you guys nonstop, they have an agenda for pushing that view of sexuality on you guys. They have a buck to make. They don't see you guys as people who are engaging in relationships, searching for something and some kind of wholeness to fill themselves, and who are in danger of being hurt. They just see you guys as people they can make money off of. But we love you guys. We care about you guys so much that we want to take a break from some of the things we usually talk about and say, this is God's design for relationships in your life. This is the way you can live in freedom and healthily and avoid, hopefully, as much of the pain and the hurt that's caused when we do relationships wrong. When we follow the way that the world tells us to live in relationships, it causes a lot of pain. And so that's why we're taking the time to do this, because we care about you guys so much. So, the thing that I want to stress tonight is that what our culture tells you is that in relationships, the physical part of the relationship is the most important. That's the predominant message that gets pushed through all these different media outlets that surround us. And this isn't true. But it is the most obvious thing on your minds probably when we talk about relationships, right? When you guys heard we're doing a series on relationships, and if your mind is anything like my mind was in high school, I think they're going to talk to us about sex. That's where they're going. But that's because that's what relationships are defined as in our culture, right? It's all about sex and the physical part of a relationship, and that's where our minds go. So I'm going to start out tonight, just to get that out of the way, I'm going to start by kind of addressing the church's traditional answer to people's questions about sex and relationships, and then God's plan for that. And so we're going to kind of like talk about those, and then we're going to go to God's plan for relationships in our life, and we're going to talk about everything else that's entailed in relationships, or at least some of the other things. Some of the things that are so much more important than the physical parts of a relationship. You guys ready? Wow, that was weak. Thanks, Jason. Jason's ready. All right. Okay, so I grew up in the church, and whenever people my age, when I was in high school or younger and things like that, like whenever people asked about relationships, and specifically about the physical part of relationships, there was one quick answer that we got, and it was, don't have sex, wait till marriage. And we were like, thanks. And that's a good answer, but it's like half the answer or a quarter of the answer. It misses so much of what relationships are about. I think you guys have been shortchanged if that's the answer that you've usually received when you're at church, when you like ask questions about relationships, or when people teach on it. If that's all you've ever gotten, then I'm sorry, because you've really missed out on God's whole plan for what relationships are supposed to look like in our life. Specifically, since we're starting out talking about sex, sex functions as a blessing and a gift when it's enjoyed the way God intended. Not when people use it the way that the world tells us to. Because, as I said, our culture's view of sex reduces it to a purely physical act. It's just a physical thing that one person does with another, is what our culture would tell you. And when it's purely a physical act, it becomes only about things like positions, performance, and partners. And that's why things like the pornography industry are so profitable in our world. Because when that's what you make relationships about, when you make it about sex and about the physical part of relationships, then that's what's going to sell. That's what people are going to look for, and they're going to be left empty. It loses what its true purpose is supposed to be. In Scripture, we see that the physical part of a relationship is supposed to solidify a covenant that two people have made to spend the rest of their lives together. And that covenant and that commitment involves so much more. And the physical part is really just like, I don't know, the icing on the cake. So, before I move on to kind of Scripture's view of the physical part of relationships, just say sex is a gift. And I said that already, but it's a gift that can cause a lot of harm if it's mishandled. Sometimes, one thing that our world does, too, it makes relationships all about the physical part, all about sex. And two, it ignores the power of that part of a relationship. Sex is extremely powerful, and its power can only be really properly handled within a marriage relationship. When Jason and I were talking earlier this week about what I would say tonight, he said that one of the most common ways he's heard this described, and I think it applies, is that sex is like fire. I didn't say my sex is on fire, which is that Kings of Leon song, but sex is like fire in that fire is best handled in a fireplace or in a fire pit, like outside. But if it's not, if fire isn't started where it's supposed to be started, it can get out of control, right? How many of you guys have seen in the news the fires that burned in Australia this last week? Killed like almost 200 people. It's like they were out of control. And I think that should give us an idea of what happens when something as powerful as sex is not handled properly. It can get out of control, and it has in our culture. And so as the church, we want to stand our ground and say, no, God has given us a plan for what relationships are supposed to look like, and this is what it is, and this is going to help people avoid all that pain and hurt that happens when it gets out of control. So, lastly, I've talked a little bit about timing tonight, because the physical part of a relationship is really all about timing in relationships. God has set things up so that things would happen in their right time. And when we skip ahead and we jump and we don't pay attention to God's timing, that's when things kind of go awry. And so I'll talk a little bit more about timing in a little bit.